Welcome, everyone, to our first concurrent panel. I'm Natalie Fremberg with the Palm Beach County Office of Resilience. We have a great panel discussion lined up for you this afternoon. Before we get started, we have a short video to spotlight climate resiliency in Palm Beach County. We will be hearing from Commissioner Maria Marino. Enjoy.
And being that I'm on the South Florida Regional Transit Authority, which is Tri-Rail, but one of the main things we can do is really see how water is flowing from one county to another county. What is our canal system? How is it working? How do we have water storage? Where is our water storage? These are very important, and it's everywhere. It's not just in Palm Beach County. We are given flood maps, and they change, and flood areas change, and insurance in those areas then changes, which is a hit to everybody's pocketbook. So we have to be more cognizant of that. And then also that translates into building code changes, because now if you're in a flood zone, you may have to build on stilts or reinforce more than you had to before. So those are some of the things that we're going to see in the future. And I think what's happening now is because of climate change, people are becoming less car-centric. And we are trying to make developments, and in the north end of the county, definitely, we're trying to make developments that service everyone so that you have walkability. Or if you want to get somewhere, you can get on a train. And being that I'm on the South Florida Regional Transit Authority, which is Tri-Rail, and we just celebrated our 100 millionth rider, that means we've taken 100 million cars off the road. So for our younger folks that don't want to drive, there are options, and I think we need to look at more of those options in the future. So golf courses are fabulous green open spaces, and even one of the courses that's owned by the county is an Audubon golf course. So you get healthy, you get to be outside, you get to enjoy the trees, the nature, the birds, and you get to be in Palm Beach County and frequent one of our golf courses, and that's a huge economic driver in our county.
Thank you, Commissioner Marino. It's great to hear our local leaders speak so passionately about environmental issues and to have their support in climate resiliency efforts. Next, we're going to dive into another great panel, Making the Investment, Innovations in Valuing and Funding Resiliency Projects. In this panel, we will discuss new funding prospects, perspectives on financing, the timing of capital and climate risk reduction, public-private partnership opportunities, and insurance perspectives on financing innovative approaches and other actions to reduce risk. Our moderator for this panel discussion is Dr. Raghuvir Vinukolu. He's the Senior Vice President and Natural Catastrophe Solutions Lead for Munich Reinsurance America, Inc. They're based in Princeton, New Jersey. He's a passionate advocate for climate adaptation and resiliency with an emphasis on the role of insurance and public-private partnerships in building resilient communities. For more on him and our other panelists, please check out their bios on the event site. Thank you for moderating today, Dr. Vinukolu.
Thank you, Natalie, and welcome everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Raghuvir Vinukolu, and I represent Munich Re America, where I focus my efforts on climate resilience and natural catastrophe solutions. Let me first thank the organizers, and especially our panel coordinator, Dr. Carolina Moran, for inviting me to the 13th Annual Climate Leadership Summit. Also want to thank the Palm Beach County and Commissioner Marino, and that was an excellent video, and also the Paragon Events for hosting this event. Today, I'm joined by a distinguished panel to discuss on a very important topic. There's a lot of good topics on the agenda, but this particular one is really exciting. It is on making the investment, innovations in valuing and funding resilience projects. But before I introduce the panel, let me take a few minutes to add a few words on this topic. In a changing climate, every part of the world is experiencing extreme weather. Many regions across the world are experiencing increased frequency and severity in catastrophe events. Let's take the example of floods, a peril that poses both chronic and acute issues in regions across the world, and especially South Florida. According to Munich Re, since 1980, the world has seen flooding-related losses exceed a total of $1 trillion. According to NOAA, floods have costed about $30 billion in the United States over the last 5 years. Now, if we take that does not include tropical cyclone-related flooding events like storm surge and TC-induced rainfall. So when we combine all these disasters, that number over the last 5 years reaches about $700 billion. So now let's take that example of how flooding is impacting the local region in South Florida, right? Recently, the Palm Beach Post reported that the November's full moon coincided with a record 3 inches of rain at the Palm Beach International Airport on November 19th, resulting in flooding in the region. Right? And that's kind of the new frequency events that people are noticing. According to NOAA's intermediate high projections, sea level rise, when we consider that as an peril that will impact people, sea levels would rise to about 17 inches by 2040, as compared to the years of 2000 levels. Right? By 2070, that number could increase about 40 inches. Again, this is specific to South Florida. And I'm sure all of you in the audience have been listening to the news on COP26, the Glasgow Summit. And one of the goals of that conference was to keep up with the targets set by the Paris Agreement, which is to limit the warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. While the current policy set would lead us to about 2.7 degrees Celsius by 2100, the increase in 2.7. Let's just take the example, the number of 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. That itself will be seeing major changes in sea level rises and extreme precipitation and droughts. So what it is clear is that the past is and will not be a representative of the future when it comes to disasters. What we will need is to think about upgrading our infrastructure. The OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, estimates that the global infrastructure investment needs are set to about $95 trillion by 2030. That's the need. What that means, it would need about $6 trillion per year. Now, we all know that every dollar spent and invested in risk mitigation and adaptation could yield about $4 to $6, right, based on the various estimates. Now, it's important that we think about resilience. So, but one exciting part, and that's a very positive news about South Florida, is that South Florida is already ahead of the curve in terms of addressing resilience. And one such effort is the county-wide resilience plan in Broward County, right? So one thing that was clear from COP26 was that there is a huge interest by the financial sector to tackle climate change. As one of the analysts from Bank of America states, climate action can be done, but everyone will need to be chipping in. Governments, central banks, capital markets, ESG, private sectors, and consumers. Now, the same analyst also mentioned that they estimate a doubling of annual investment in the global energy systems alone by $5 trillion each year over the next 30 years, adding up to around $150 trillion, which is about 2 times the current GDP, global GDP. So, having said that, all the investments and all the interest in investment from the financial sector. On that note, let me jump to this important topic about making the investment for resilience. So we are, as I mentioned, we're joined by a distinguished panel here. Today, we have Amy Knowles, who is the Chief Resilience Officer for City of Miami Beach. We have Mark Brown, who's the Deputy Manager for Office of Financial Management and Budget for Palm Beach County. Matt Kuchek, Vice President for Environmental, Social, and Governance Outreach and Research for Moody's. And Paula Panier, who's America's lead for Climate and Resilience Hub for Willis Towers Watson. Welcome, everyone. So let me start with a question to all of you, and we'll go with the sequencing of Amy, Mark, Matt, and Paula. Right? So in a couple of minutes, if you can all describe your role, and if I may request Amy to give us a sense of the sources of funding available for community resilience. And other panelists, please include anything else that you would add on top of it. Amy?
Sure. Thank you. I'd be happy to kick us off, and it's wonderful to see you all today. And thank you for Megan and her team for all the work that you're doing on this conference. So about me personally, I have a lifetime public service background. I've been the Chief Resilience Officer for about 2 years in Miami Beach. I've done a lot of work in environmental protection, sustainability planning, and most recently, resilience strategy planning. I'm also currently the Interim Environment and Sustainability Director. So my role here is to move forward planning policies and projects that will help to plan and protect us from all the shocks and stresses we see from climate change. So I very much focus on climate resilience issues. In terms of funding, some of the things we've done on Miami Beach and available to municipalities are general obligation bonds, stormwater fees, water and sewer fees, and grants, also repurposing interlocal agreement funding as well as CRA funding. So those are some of the things that we have done on Miami Beach. I think it's really important also to think about dedicating revenue from future growth projects towards resilience as well. In our experience, these projects are not separate from existing project needs. It's more about integrating our planning for the future today. So thank you.
I'm Mark Braun. I'm the debt manager for Palm Beach County. And in that capacity, I'm at the front line as far as funding. And when we're talking about financing capital projects in the capital markets, specifically the municipal bond market, whether we be issuing general obligation bonds or non-ad valorem bonds. That's what I'm dealing with as far as financing sources. It's the bond market. Thank you.
Great. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. My name's Matt Kuchak, and I've been with Moody's for about 8.5 years. The vast majority of my time was in Moody's Investor Service, which is the credit rating agency arm of Moody's. Most people, I think of when they think of Moody's. And I've been since August as part of our ESG Solutions Group, which is a relatively new group we formed last year that really seeks to provide ESG solutions in sustainable finance, ESG, and climate to a wide range of stakeholders in the market. My particular role, I kind of wear two hats. So I lead our sustainable finance research and outreach. So basically how sustainable debt markets are developing, and I sit on some of the industry working groups. And I also help manage the team that provides second party opinions, which is a type of external review for sustainable bonds. So we'll talk a little bit more about those activities as we go through, but thanks again for the opportunity to be here today.
And thank you, everyone. A pleasure to be here with you all. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Paula Panier. I lead the Americas practice for the Climate and Resilience Hub at Willis Towers Watson. What we focus on is bringing climate analytics and strategic advisory to inform resilience strategies. So working on the quantification on the physical impacts of climate change, the transition risk and opportunities in our path to a net zero economy, and the liability risks. We bring this know-how and quantification to embed these insights into the development of resilience strategies. Why is this so important? Why do we focus so much on quantification? Because, for example, when a county or a state wants to reach out to investors, there can be solid numbers that back up their investment plans and the business plans behind it, and their current and future climate scenarios. And also informing from the transition perspective. For example, if there's ports involved or infrastructure where the operations worldwide are going to change in a decarbonized economy by the price of fuel or the movements of tourism, the tourism industry, or supply chains around the world, that can be modeled and can be embedded in these plans to be presented to investors, to be presented to regulators, and also to the public, so they understand why a government entity is deciding to move ahead with certain resilience strategies. So very pleased to be here and looking forward to this exchange.
Excellent. So as I mentioned, this is quite an amazing panel, looking from someone who is right at the county level, at the ground level, working on resilience projects, to all the way representing insurance industry, but also rating agencies, right? So this is quite a panel. Thank you all for being here. Let me ask, based on the comments, Amy and Mark, and in terms of the funding, the sources of funding, in your perspective, are these sources of funding enough to advance the significant resilience investments needed for South Florida and in general for the state of Florida?
Well, I like to kind of answer this question in two ways. I think sometimes we speak very generally about resilience funding, but really we're looking at two main issues. We have public infrastructure that needs funding, and then we have private infrastructure. So on Miami Beach, we are 70% owned by private landowners. And the rest is some compilation, of government owned. So we need to do a lot in terms of, our roads, our bridges, our seawalls, our stormwater systems, our water and sewer systems. But on the private side, there's so much that has to be done in terms of elevation, in terms of protection, in terms of private seawalls. For example, Miami Beach, we 55 miles of seawalls is what we have, but only about 5 are publicly owned. So I think it's a dual issue. It's a dual challenge. At this point, we know that about $2 billion of investment is worth it on Miami Beach, very conservatively, when we see the amount of risks that we face. But is there enough funding right now? I think the big answer is no. We're thrilled to see this federal funding coming down. We're all, I think, very excited to see how that's going to be applied. We were more than thrilled to receive, more than $28 million in this recent Resilient Florida funding. But the need is definitely far greater than I think what's immediately able to be accessed.
Would you like to add anything? Okay, Paula and Matt. Good. Thank you. Thanks, Amy. And let me move to an important topic about these financial processes. Maybe I'll start with Mark this time and go to Matt. What metrics do you think are really important and being reported as part of the financing processes? How can governments, as issuers of these ESG bonds, get more of a translation into pricing and benefit economically?
Well, investor goodwill is generated by being at the forefront, and Palm Beach County is already dealing with climate change. So when we issue bonds to finance capital projects, we want to broaden our potential investor base. And by being ahead of the curve in terms of demonstrating that these projects and the bonds that finance these projects have environmental and socially conscious component embedded in them, we believe that that we will attract a broad base, will broaden our investor base. And I think as time goes on, issuers will see a penalty for not being cognizant of investors' demand for ESG or resiliency in the marketplace. So as far as how can we benefit more, translate this into pricing, I think issuers need to be able to tell their story to the market and investors and the rating agencies. So a market accepted framework and ESG disclosure standards will go a long way to help with that. But currently, the rating agencies want to know about issuers' resiliency and cybersecurity initiatives, and that's something we weren't even being asked about just a few years ago. So it's already happening.
Yeah, and I think I could take a little bit even more of a macro view. I think what you said, Mark, is definitely aligned with what we're seeing here from kind of a global perspective. And I think sustainable bonds, essentially labeled debt instruments that are for either green, which really focus on environmental, social, which obviously focus on social projects, or sustainability, which kind of combine the two. We're seeing a huge increase in global issuance, and we're expecting across kind of all sectors, all regions, actually about 1 trillion of labeled debt this year that have some sort of sustainability label. So a huge increase over where we were just a few years ago. Still a relatively small part of the market, even in the municipal space in the US. So we're probably around 25 billion of labeled sustainable bonds in the US this year. Still a relatively small fraction of global sustainable issuance. And if you look at roughly 500 billion of municipal issuance overall this year, a relatively small part of the market, but one we've seen really grow over time. And part of what's driving that growth is the increased interest from investors and other stakeholders for not only municipal governments, but also issuers really across the board. And sustainable bonds have been a way to essentially open that dialogue with investors and other stakeholders about what issuers are doing in terms of financing, whether it's as specific as climate projects or more broadly sustainable projects. And in essence, a lot of these instruments are the same as a traditional debt instrument from a credit quality standpoint, from a maturity standpoint, from a security standpoint. So they maintain their existing investors, and they potentially, by labeling bonds with some sort of sustainable label, can attract new groups of investors who might be really focused on these instruments purely for the sustainable label. So in some cases, it's certainly not guaranteed, but that excess demand from investors above and beyond what typically might be expected for a similar interest for similar issuance may actually lead to a bit of a pricing benefit for issuers. So we've heard some examples of that. It's, again, not something that is guaranteed, but we're hearing that that extra level of demand from investors may help influence pricing, or at the very least broaden the investor base and interest in the debt instruments. So we're seeing it as a way, one, for issuers, expand that investor base, help draw attention to some of the good work they're doing in terms of environmental and social projects, and in many cases as well, often using those projects to help improve their risk profile from an environmental and social standpoint.
Yeah, that's great, Matt. So on that note, maybe can you give us some more detail on the focusing on the ESG? I know there's types of ESG related scores that Moody's provides. How are these being used by investors and other market participants?
Yeah, and I think it's a great question. I think it's a quite complex space now, and the work we've done at kind of the Moody's Corporation levels really grown quite a bit in recent years. So on one hand, you've got the work being done in Moody's Investor Service, the rating agency, where the credit ratings, which have been around for a century, that measure the probability of default and loss given default. Our colleagues over there have really started to publish scores that help explain how ESG risks impact credit. So we updated our methodology a couple of years ago and introduced what are called issuer profile scores and credit impact scores. We've published, I think it's around 1,700 scores to date for issuers around the globe, and a subset of those being municipal governments in the US. And those scores aim to explain how do ESG risks impact credit quality potentially, and then ultimately what impact those those scores have had to date on the actual credit rating. So we're trying to be much more transparent from the rating agency perspective, and have been asked by our investors and clients for a while to more clearly articulate and quantify how ESG risks are impacting credit. So it's one way we've tried to bring that transparency. Where I currently sit today in Moody's ESG Solutions, there's a number of things we've done. Just to highlight a couple, we have kind of standalone physical climate risk scores that we've recently expanded for sub-sovereign entities that really aim to give not only investors, but also insurance companies, banks, governments, and regulators a better sense of to what extent certain areas are exposed to physical climate hazards, whether it's sea level rise, extreme precipitation, wildfire risk. So that's really been a big focus, to provide those kind of standalone solutions. And the team that I help manage actually also provides second party opinions, which are external reviews that essentially score various aspects of sustainable debt transactions. So to give you an example, the city of Tampa recently did a green bond and financed around 26 projects to essentially enhance the resiliency of their stormwater infrastructure. So we were asked to provide an opinion that essentially gave a second view of how legitimately green and sustainable those projects were. So our scores will assess a few things. So on one hand, we assess whether those the issuer's framework and projects are aligned with the green bond principles, which is a set of international standards and best practices for issuing green bonds. So it looks at essentially the use of proceeds, reporting, management of proceeds, project selection. So in the case of Tampa, we said that their framework and projects were aligned with the green bond principles. And then we also assess essentially the expected positive environmental and social impacts of the projects, as well as the issuer's management of ESG risks associated with those projects. And that overall got us to a robust, which is the second highest score in terms of the overall contribution to sustainability that those projects would have. So essentially between the credit rating side, the sustainable bond opinion side, we're hoping to provide investors and other market participants with a better sense of the risk profile and positive impacts that issuers are ultimately looking to have through their sustainable debt transactions. So it's definitely an evolving space, and we're seeing a lot of demand for those services as the market grows for sustainable debt instruments.
That's very interesting, Matt. And definitely not the same Moody's that we had known before, which was traditionally a credit rating agency. Now you're really going into the data analytics and also thinking about valuing some of these infrastructure, these projects, and making it more comprehensible for these investors. I we're already starting to see some questions, but let me move to Amy, back to you. As you see, Matt mentioned about some of the about valuing. This panel is about valuing and funding these resilience projects, right? As the Chief Resilience Officer for Miami Beach, what are some of the challenges and opportunities that you face when considering these resilience projects?
Sure, thank you. Well, I will start with the positive. I'll start with the opportunities. I think we have a huge opportunity as South Florida, as cities, as counties, to really kind of redesign our cities with some really solid urban planning. I mean, I think there's been a lot of errors in the past with so much focus on gray infrastructure, not enough green, not enough thought for the environment. And as we've looked at our projects, we're very, very carefully making sure that we're integrating what our community wants now. These projects are about people ultimately, and it's about protecting people. And it's also an opportunity to improve their quality of life. We are integrating our mobility plans, wider sidewalks, adding bike lanes. We are, correcting a lot of the water and sewer needs that need to happen, fixing fire flow, better water pressure. We're also making sure that we can handle different and bigger storm events. So those are all positive things for our community now while protecting for the future. We have budgeted about $288 million for current neighborhood adaptation projects. And the way we're breaking down those projects now is probably much different than what we would have in the past. It's about 2 years of planning with each neighborhood. It's a couple years of design, and then a couple more years of actual construction. So these are very complex projects. And our seawalls alone, we have a challenge of all these seawalls that need to be raised and rehabilitated. But we're also adding in living shorelines and hybrid seawalls so people can better enjoy our natural environment. And so we're stimulating the coastal habitat and fisheries. So it is an opportunity to invest in your community and create a better community. Challenge-wise, I would say these projects they're very complex, they're very hard. We've had to invest a lot of resources into community engagement, to community co-design, to really thoughtfully thinking about where equipment is going to be sited, how to get through these projects, many layers of approval, I think locally and all the way up to the state. So those are some of the challenges. It's so kind of much easier just to rip up a road and put in a pipe, but when you also need to kind of replace all the utilities and elevate that road, it is creating a lot more complexity, even including, personal investments in terms of harmonization. Even including, I mentioned the mobility concerns, but we don't want to put things back in the same way. We have a goal to make them better.
Great, thank you, Amy. That's really interesting. And as you talked about some of these challenges, one thing that I just read recently was about how of course, elevating roads is important, but building codes become even more important over time. And in Palm Beach County, I think there was a study where the new building code requirement could be as much as 3 feet above the BFE or something like that, right? So how does the county think about those kind of the challenges in terms of addressing these building codes? Sorry, go ahead. If you, because there was one question, and it was basically saying what role do community-based organizations play in the process of leveraging resilience investments for the benefit of residents most impacted by climate change and related harms? Anyone take that question?
Yeah, I'm happy to just take a stab. I think your first question about the change in building codes, that is, very well taken. It's about 5 years ago that in Miami Beach, we changed a lot of our land development regulations to require construction to be higher than what FEMA requires. And we are like 97% of our land is in the FEMA special flood hazard area. So we know that we have to build very protectively, and we know because of sea level rise, we have to build higher. So I think that those code changes have to come. We've tried to take the lead on those, but we definitely welcome that. In terms of community-based organizations, it's so incredibly important to have involvement, I think, as government with organizations. And we have an excellent sustainability committee that is always bringing items forward into our attention as community or as a city moving these projects forward. We have really, really strong and active neighborhood associations, and we really rely on them and their knowledge of the neighborhood in terms of what these projects may do and the impacts and how to make sure we have all those co-benefits. So I think the more involvement, the better. And then I think we have a lot of really active organizations across Miami-Dade County that have really pushed climate knowledge, climate action, a sense of urgency forward as well. And we really welcome that.
Great. Thank you. Thanks. Mark, moving to a bit from your experience in the Palm Beach County, how is the county emphasizing, let's say, the ESG goals and compliance? Could you just describe some specific goals and performance metrics that are being measured by the county to illustrate how investment in ESG and resilience is evolving? And is there a way that these are being these metrics are being proposed, and also how are they being tracked?
Raghuveer, Palm Beach County's capital projects construction manual requires projects to consider resiliency and sustainability best practices in the planning of those projects. Metrics such as kilowatt hours saved, kilowatt hours generated by renewable energy, gallons of water saved beyond code requirements are being incorporated into checklists that demonstrate compliance as well as track these and other metrics. Additionally, Palm Beach County's Office of Resiliency has conducted a greenhouse gas emissions inventory as related to county operations, and they're using this data to evaluate greenhouse gas reduction strategies impacting total greenhouse gas emissions and as well as greenhouse gas emissions per capita. Additionally, county cross-departmental teams have resiliency metrics such as miles of streets swept, volume of sand placed for beach nourishment, acres of parks per resident, miles of bike lanes, etc. Beyond just sustainability and ESG and resiliency, Palm Beach County is very much about performance metrics. So this is a great fit, hand in glove.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate those comments. There was a question that just came in, which is really something very interesting in terms of nature-based solutions. And the question is really, what type of programs purchase wetlands and undeveloped areas to sequester carbon and hold water, hold floodwaters, right? And Paula, maybe let me get this to you, because especially investment in natural infrastructure has lagged significantly as compared to gray infrastructure. So if you could talk about some innovative financing strategies for natural infrastructure and how that's being worked on for Florida and any other global programs that you can talk about, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you for this. And maybe to bring an additional angle to the discussion based on this component of natural assets, what we are noting is a change in the understanding of the value of these assets, especially as corporations and the public sector are looking into climate disclosures, different standards of climate disclosures. There's a new understanding and consideration of the value that natural assets truly can have in minimally the operations and sustainable operations in the future for these types of entities, public or private. So to begin with, just being able to assign a value to those assets changes the discussion entirely, because then we cannot avoid looking at that value, and we need to embed it into the strategies that are backing up our plans, operational and business plans. So I believe that's one component that's of the essence of a game changer that's happening, especially in a transitional economy. Second, there's more and more cases internationally, although it's growing slowly, but there's a lot of effort being put into risk financing to protect not only the natural assets, mangroves, reefs, you name it, swamps, but also the communities that are living and that are having productive activities that are source of an economy in the coastal areas. So as we demonstrate worldwide that we can protect these assets and also involve the community and all the productive activities under the protection that insurance can bring, especially with parametric products, it's also a game changer in the conversation with investors, because then the investment in resilient infrastructure, green and or gray, can be backed up by this protection. Insurance can work as a backup for those investments. So those are new areas that we're seeing are really helping connect the discussion among the different stakeholders. Over.
Thank you, Paula. And I think there was just another question that came in. Probably we can tie in your comments here. The question is, can we hear if any mitigation, especially in greenhouse gas emission reductions, building green energy strategies, are they being financed, and or why it is sounding like mostly adaptation is drawing colors?
Can maybe start actually I think obviously talking a lot about resilience and adaptation, I think is very pertinent in the Florida context. But if we look globally, at least at labeled sustainable bonds, the vast majority of investment has actually been on the kind of mitigation side. So, I'd say it's something like 97% of green bond proceeds have been more on the mitigation side, relatively small on the adaptation side. So we're seeing a lot of investment, renewable energy, green buildings, energy efficiency, clean transportation, and clean water projects as well, kind of beyond the mitigation side. So kind of from a global standpoint, it's actually quite a bit of focus on mitigation. I think obviously adaptations is very important and will be increasingly so. We're seeing as we get kind of past the point where, there's only so much mitigation we can do. And if we kind of look at the next 30 years from a, greenhouse gas emission reduction standpoint, what we do today on a mitigation standpoint, it's not going to have a huge impact in what we're going to see over the next 3 decades from an actual kind of climate outcome standpoint. So increasingly, we're expecting adaptation and resilience to become more and more important, especially in the governmental context. And for those governments that are most exposed, it's obviously going to be a big piece of the capital planning going forward. So I think that's why there's such a growing focus, especially of our work here today, in terms of talking about adaptation and resilience. But actually, from a financing standpoint, to date, it's been mostly on the mitigation side.
Amy, I think you were trying to add some comments. Anything?
No, I mean, just adding that investment is incredibly important as well, investing in mitigation. I mean, we do a greenhouse gas inventory, we have goals, we have very ambitious goals, and we're developing a climate action plan. And so it's so important to involve your CFO. We've had meetings with ours to really engage your property managers and to understand how to transition your assets, your buildings, to renewables, to energy reduction. But it is a journey. It's a lot of different steps. We're looking kind of at old legacy systems right now and transitioning them forward. So it's something that is part of our budget conversations, and we are also, very much, it's very much a goal for us.
Raghuveer, I could add in there that
Sure.
it's interesting because from the perspective of risk management, we speak of mitigation also in terms of how much risk we can transfer, but the risk is underlying recognition that risk is evolving. So again, what's the view of risk today and in the future? And risk transfer will continue to have a role, but really what we aim to help inform with the quantification we do is how much can be enacted in order to prevent and reduce the exposure and vulnerability to future risks, so risk now, but also in future scenarios. Whatever we cannot tackle from that angle, then would we transfer to risk transfer? But really, if we look at it from that perspective, we're in a way already talking about adaptation. Risk transfer will still be there, but everything we do right now is in order to adapt to be able to manage the vulnerability to risks in the future.
That is such an important point, Paula, and I think just wanted to bring in my perspective there. I think if we talk about risk transfer, especially bringing in the insurance component, right? What is changing with this changing risk is the underlying value at risk, but also because it's not a stable climate anymore, we're talking about a change in the standard deviation or what's the variance. So an uncertainty in the insurance world is always means higher premiums. So it's not only just the incremental increase in the value at risk, but also the uncertainty, because we're seeing this changes in frequency and severity quite drastically. So now those really appreciated comments there. But Paula, let me stay with that topic about the insurance. Now we've been learning that investing in resilience infrastructure now can help maintain the credit ratings and assist in reducing interest rates, but also reducing insurance costs, right? So what are the additional strategies and mechanisms local and regional governments are considering to make the business case for investors? I think it would be great to get your perspective, what you're seeing, of course, beyond Florida, but then I also wanted to bring it back to Amy to answer this same question, if that's okay.
So what we are seeing and what we're engaging on is being able to quantify and understand the current present value of the savings in losses in the future by investing in resilience today. So for example, working with the Nature Conservancy, we have released a report in which we can demonstrate that by investing in ecological forestry, we can reduce insurance costs of wildfire by 40% in the future. I understand that Munich Re has also done similar studies. So we believe that that is where we can bring our risk modeling and understanding of the risk, all these capabilities up front, so that we can help governmental entities understand the present value of future savings. Because then, as Amy was referring earlier in the panel, we're really looking into strategies for the future. But for that, we need to start investing today. So I hope that answered your question. Probably over to
that absolutely does, and I think those two reports were really really interesting and very close to my heart, because I think I've always been a proponent that mitigation is really important, especially risk mitigation in terms of kind of managing and having sustainable insurance solutions. So really good report there. In one question that came in, and maybe this is for Matt, there's a lot of thoughts going on in my mind, so sorry if I'm jumping around here, but I also want to make sure that I address all the questions from the audience here. Matt, this is probably the question for you. Where does the majority of the pressure for investors to incorporate ESG metrics come from? Is it mainly ROI related, social pressure, etc.?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's the answer is going to vary a little bit based on the investor. I think there's a lot of motivating factors here. I think one is purely from a credit or equity analysis standpoint, understanding the potential ESG risks that an entity faces is incredibly important when you're just doing your investment due diligence. So, the incorporation of ESG, understanding how you're exposed to climate risk, carbon transition, governance risks, social issues, pretty fundamental to understanding the risk profile of the investment opportunity. So there is, purely from the investment analysis standpoint, for some investors, it's their clients that are pushing to understand, the impact of their investments or how they're thinking about environmental, social, and governance risks. We're seeing increasing sort of governmental and regulatory pressure to incorporate ESG and to have, disclosure standards there as well. So it's really coming from a number of different areas, but ultimately all of those are working toward, similar goals.
And if I could just add to sort of build on what you said, I do think it's incredibly important that the ESG approaches are also informed by the actions that governments are taking and that cities and counties are taking. Because I think it was Mark that said on one of our prep calls that we can't really move our location. Our geography is pretty set. We can't pick up our locations and move. So we're well aware of our risk. And we're in Hurricane Alley. We know that, which is only going to get worse over time. So it is really important that we have the opportunity to demonstrate the policies that we've set, the plans that we have. But I think more importantly is that the projects and the actions that we're taking, because looking from a global scale, perhaps the risk reduction isn't maybe grand enough in certain ways to see, but on the ground level, in terms of what's actually happening and the real experience and the avoided flooding and the avoided damages and people being able to be protected, it's very real. So I think sort of taking that high level risk management approach and bringing it down to our new water and sewer systems, which are having less overflows, those avoided tidal flood events because our roads are elevated, being able to handle these larger capacity, faster storms that are more intense. Really understanding that for us, a couple feet of a seawall makes a really big difference in terms of protection. And being able to, take all of that and being able to communicate that with the investor industry. I think that's really important that we continue to connect.
Great. No, thanks so much. I see that we are almost 3 minutes away from time. So what I'll do is maybe give 30 seconds each for all of you to maybe have some closing comments. I mean, there was so much discussed, but let's start the opposite direction. Maybe Paula, why don't you go first and then we'll go the reverse direction.
Happy to. Well, I think what we have discussed today is really many different approaches or points of view to this discussion. So what I would encourage is that when we think about resilience, we can feel comfortable with the fact that different stakeholders are already being connected. There's platforms to connect them. There's tools to connect them. So we can really look into a holistic approach to resilience and have the basis for the dialogue.
Holistic approach to resilience. Matt.
Yeah, I mean, we could spend I think a whole conference just on this panel. So there's a lot of great content today. For me, one of the big areas that we're looking at more from a global standpoint, I think is very applicable here is comparability of data and approaches. So something, Amy, you mentioned about kind of bringing that high level risk down and understanding what's happening at the individual entity level. I think that's a big piece, and being able to compare which strategies maybe sound good versus those that are really, really impactful. It's something we're getting better at. And Mark mentioned our colleagues in the rating agency, they've got good underlying data to understand the risk exposure. And there's having those conversations with individual cities about the steps they're taking to help mitigate and adapt to those challenges.
Thank you, Matt. Going to Mark.
Well, just to pick up where, as Matt referenced, we need comparability, we need standards, a market framework, because eventually, right now there's a demand for municipal bonds, but eventually investors are probably going to choose green, ESG, resilient, sustainable bonds that address sustainability compared to ones that lack that ESG component, and thereby impacting investor demand, yields, and ultimately the cost of capital. And I think it's our job and to borrow the word of the day, holistically, it's our job to be at the forefront of this and to tell the story, our story, and the bigger story to increase awareness.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark and Amy, finally, but not least.
Thank you. That was a really good point, Mark. Writing that one down. I just want to add that I think it's so important for the government folks on the line. It's so important to not only plan, but to get ready to act, because the more positioned you are for investments, the more likely you are to attract funding. And I think it's very easy to say there's not enough money out there, but when you really start to do the work and do that planning and do the project planning and get into the complexity, these are multi-year investments. And so I think it's really important to position our cities and counties for funding, and that will attract investment. We have to be able to afford it, of course, and that's a whole other issue. But I do believe that there's a lot of money there. So just thank you so much. It's just a pleasure being part of this panel. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, everyone. And we're right on time. So thank you so much. I think that was a great topic. And as Amy mentioned in her comments earlier, yeah, definitely we should the positives first. Challenge is always there, right? But I think the positive note is definitely that there is a lot of investment out there, and we need to channel them to the right projects. So thank you so much, everyone. Back to you, Natalie, if that.
Thank you, Dr. Vinukulu, for moderating the session, and to all of our panelists for participating in this discussion. I think we all got a lot out of it. Next up, we have another pair of concurrent sessions for you to choose from. They are Building Better, Embedding Resilience in Capital Infrastructure, and 0 Hour, the economic imperative of decarbonization and a just transition. To join these next sessions, please go to the CVent portal and click on the link for the next session. Bye, everyone.